If you would go ahead and grab your Bibles, turn to Matthew 24. We're going to get into 23 first. We're going to start in 23 and work our way through 24. We got a chunk to cover today. So that's why I texted Joel. I was like, hey, can we just do 2 songs instead of 3? I hate doing that, but there's a lot for us to cover. And then everybody got sick, and now Joel has to run sound. And so Joel's running sound, but I'm thrilled to be doing this morning. But honestly, it's a lot. It's heavy, and it's thick, and it's confusing. And for thousands of years, Christians have tried to decide how to interpret these verses. So I do not stand before you as the one who's figured it out. I'm not that guy. I'm going to do the best I can with the text that's laid before us, and we're going to try to walk through it together. But I do believe what I want us to see is the heart of Jesus. So more than being right with how we interpret the passage, I want us to be right with who Jesus is. Let's do that. Let's let the text teach us that here this morning. So on the screen will be some scripture I'm going to use this morning, but I cover a decent bit of it, I think, but I'm going to get into some of the Old Testament stuff, but you just need to know, I'm going to reference it. You might need to go to it. And so since it's not on the screen, let me tell you what it is. Daniel chapter 7 through 12, which sounds fun already, doesn't it, for you to read? That's the book of Daniel. Isaiah 13, I'm going to go there. And then I'm going to go to Acts 1 and Luke 24. Good? All right, so let's talk a bit. Anybody remember Y2K? Y2K, year 2000? Yep. I'm old enough to remember that. Many of you are old enough to remember that. My dad was a computer programmer, and so Y2K was a big deal in my house. Because if everything went the way it was supposed to go, my dad would lose his job, we would have no money, we'd have to move to some compound somewhere and eat beans and weenies the rest of our lives. Like that's what was happening. So the belief was when the calendar switched from 1999 to the year 2000, all computers who ran off of a 2-digit year would completely freak out. You would lose all of your retirement, which we don't need turn of the year to do that. That happens automatically when you lose all of that. So that would happen. We would lose all sorts of banking information. You would lose personal information. That was the fear. It would be the end of the world. And so Time Magazine actually had one of their editions come out. It says the end of the world, asking about the Y2K apocalypse is the language that was used about Y2K. So here we are, 24 years later. We're doing okay. Some of us wish it would have ended back then, would have saved us a whole lot of headaches, but here's where we are. But around that same time, there's a guy named David Hutchins who came out with a book called Y2K equals 666. And if you notice, it's been revised. You know why, right? Because it doesn't, right? But you can still buy it. It's just the revised edition. You open the first pages, no, that's the book. So around this time, a lot of that's happening because when fear happens, people insert belief into it to try to make sense of fear. And so this was happening, 666 meaning a revelation reference to what we would call the mark of the beast. That's a different series, Lord willing, we might get to in the fall. And then from there, though, earlier before, it's not the first time this happened. Anybody remember a guy by the name of Harold Camping? Harold Camping wrote a book called 1994? Question mark? Harold Camping's belief was that the Lord would return in 1994. Jesus did not. So Camping himself revised it and said it would happen May 21st, 2011. And Jesus did not. And so then he said, oh, I was wrong. It's actually October 21st, 2011. And Jesus did not. So what happens is we try to make sense of a number of different things, and we write books about it, to sell books, all sorts of things. In the 80s, a guy by the name of Hal Lindsey wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. He predicted Jesus would return in 1988. And if there was ever a time for Jesus to return, I believe the 80s would have been the best time for him to return. All the windbreakers, the whole thing. But thousands of people got excited. They mortgaged their properties. They sold land. They quit their jobs. And none of it actually happened. 88 was a big year, apparently, because Edgar C. Whisenant wrote a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. Biblically, I guess there's some connection to the number 88, and so he made these connections to it. He has yet to revise this book. But the Trinity Broadcasting Network, TBN, you've seen them, the big hair. and Holy Cloths, TBN, they actually paused programming in 1988 in expectation of the rapture. And then the next day, just resumed programming as if nothing had happened, because nothing had happened. And so that's where that came from. You remember December 21st a few years ago with the Mayan calendar? We were all worried about that. It was the end of the world. How would we know how to count days? Because this was happening. And then just a few years ago, we were sure that COVID was the end of the world. We were sure of it. And we were ready for it. Some of us were not. Some of us stocked up on toilet paper. The rest of us could not. But you were ready for the end of the world. See, every generation has this belief that the end of the world will happen in their timeline, like in their time frame, in their generation. We just think we're special, it's gonna come now, and we can all relate it back to certain biblical ideas. And then what happens is there's extremes that come. So on one hand, you've got the extreme of obsession. And on the obsession extreme, everything points to the end of the world. So every new war, every new prime minister is the Antichrist. Every new war is Gog and Magog getting together. Everything is everything. And so everything you see in the news cycle, we turn to make something biblical or spiritual or apocalyptic about it. That's obsession. Every new school board president we have, every new principal that comes into a public school, we make some decisions about the end of the world. That's obsession. The other extreme is apathy, where we don't consider this at all. You don't consider at all the fact that Jesus has promised to return. We don't consider at all that these ends of times are coming. It will be something that happens. And so those are the two extremes. And in the middle, I think, is somewhere where we should land biblically. And I think Jesus is pretty clear about it. But I need you to know that as I step into teaching this chapter, and I do it with trepidation and humility, I don't know all the answers. I've done the best I can with it. I've lost sleep over it. I've poured over scripture. I was excited at first to teach it, and then I started really studying it, and I was like, maybe Daryl could teach it. That would be good. But there's a lot in here. So I'm gonna make some statements that are about how I believe this is best interpreted, but I'm open-handed with that. So in following Jesus, there are issues that are close-handed, they are orthodox Christian belief that we do not back away from. Jesus is the perfect Son of God, born of a virgin, lived a perfect life, died a physical death on a cross, and physically rose from the dead on the third day. We believe that. And to move away from that means that you actually aren't a Christian. But some of these things, secondary issues, are things that we can, as Christians, brothers and sisters, debate about and have different conversations about. We don't need to argue and fight and call names. It's just the way that we interpret scripture, particularly when it comes to the end times. Because we're gonna learn here in Matthew 24, Jesus asked about the end times, and Jesus' response is, I don't know. So if Jesus doesn't know, I don't know why we think we know. Like, let me help you, Jesus. 1988, that's when you should return. So I want you to know that as we get into it. What we need to discuss this morning is, what does it look like to be a follower of Jesus in this world right now? What does it look like for us to follow Jesus in a world that feels like it's getting darker by the moment? How do we follow Jesus? And I want you to know, every generation has thought the same thing about their world getting darker by the moment. So let's back it all up. I want to go to Matthew 23:36 to give us some context. Jesus has made his way into Jerusalem. He's been unleashed. Gloves are off, no holds barred. He's speaking truth without a whole lot of filter. And the Jews thought he would do so with the Roman Empire, but instead he makes a pit stop at the temple first. And this is where he's unleashing his passion and his wrath with the religious leaders of the day. They're the ones holding the people of God in oppression. They're the ones keeping them from the gospel. It's not the government, instead it's the church. And so Jesus begins there. And in Matthew 23, we looked at it last week, he gives 7 woes to the Pharisees. This is what you've become, you hypocrites, you actors. And he talks about them killing all the prophets from A to Z, from Abel to Zechariah. And he finishes with this statement in verse 36. Truly I say to you, Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, all these things will come upon this generation. So he speaks directly to the Pharisees, and he's saying, hey, the blood of the martyrs is on your hands, and you will pay for it. And that phrase, this generation, speaks specifically to that generation of Pharisees. You've allowed all this to happen, and the Messiah is in your midst, and you've missed it. Therefore, you will pay for it. The blood of the martyrs is on your hands. And then Jesus quickly gets to verse 37. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. And so he takes the scope of impending wrath and he moves it from just the Pharisees now to the city of Jerusalem. Now, it's not about the city. It's in the very same way that you would say we got a news alert, news that came out of Washington, D.C. D.C. has decided blank. D.C. didn't decide anything. A few people in D.C. decided it, and it came from the actual city of D.C. Jerusalem would have been that kind of idea, the capital of the Jewish faith. And so what Jesus is doing, he's associating the failure of the Pharisees to see the Messiah, and he's saying now it affects all of you. This is all of it. The city that kills prophets and stones those who are sent to it. Again, the reference back to the end of 23. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings? Notice the compassion of Jesus. I wanted to care for you. I wanted to protect you. I wanted to hold you close and give you the truth. I wanted you to be nurtured and find flourishing with me, and yet you were not willing. You had your own idea. I tried and I tried, but instead you went your own direction. See, verse 38, your house is left to you desolate. Back in Matthew 21, Jesus said that you've turned my Father's house into a den of thieves, meaning the temple. But now Jesus no longer calls it his Father's house. He calls it their house. It's like when your kids get in trouble and you tell your wife, look what your son did. Both of yours, but on that day, he's all hers. This is what he's saying. It's yours. And now look, it's going to be desolate. It's going to be a barren wasteland with no one to care for it. It will be empty, no activity. For I tell you, Jesus says, you won't see me again until you say, here's prophetic language of the Messiah, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. You won't see me again until we all agree that I am who I claim that to be. You won't see me again until then. So from there, in Matthew 24, Jesus leaves the temple. He's made his declaration. It's day 2 or so of this Holy Week before his crucifixion, and he's going away when his disciples came out. And they pointed out to him the buildings of the temple. Mark and Luke tell us they were saying how beautiful the temple. Jesus, do you see how beautiful this is? You see, Herod had given a bunch of money to rebuild the temple. And there were certain portions of the temple that were made to model him and to point glory to him. But Jesus answered them, you see all this, don't you? You see it all? But I'm telling you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. It's kind of a buzzkill, right? They're like, look how beautiful. He's like, yeah, it's terrible. I'm killing all of it. I'm going to destroy all of it. And then they make their way in verse 3 to the Mount of Olives, which makes theologians call this, chapter 24 and 25, the Olivet Discourse. So if you've heard that phrase before, it's where it comes from. He's sitting on the Mount of Olives, where he's already sat on the way in to show his disciples what's happening. And he's sitting there, and the disciples come to him privately. We learn later it's probably just 4 of the disciples who ask the question. And they say, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And here's where the theological scholars find all sorts of different viewpoints. And it all centers around how many questions did the disciples just ask? Now, some would say it's all one question. Some would say, no, it's at least 3 questions. And a lot would say it's just 2 different questions. And if you read through Jesus' answer, here's where I land, here's where I think most reputable scholars that I've read in commentaries, here's where they land, that it is 2 questions. Because Jesus gives them 2 answers to the questions. So that's where I land. That's what I think the Bible teaches. You can disagree, totally fine. We can still love each other. You can be wrong, I can be right. We can agree on that together. I'm just kidding. It's really muddy and murky, but here's where I think the best interpretation lies when it comes to this. Because from here, I believe Jesus answers 2 different questions. The first question was, when will these things? And speaking of these things, he just talks about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. So the question is, when is that going to happen? Now for the Jews, the understanding was the Messiah would come, that the temple would be destroyed, all the Jews would be brought back together, and the Roman government would be overthrown. That would all happen when the Messiah comes. It's all one big event. And Jesus is helping them peel that apart to understand, actually, it's not. I've got different plans here. And so I believe the first question of the fall of Jerusalem is answered in verses 4 through 35. And I believe that is all answered because in verse 34, Jesus says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place. These things, answering the question, when will these things happen? A generation biblically is 40 years. He just told the Pharisees, the blood is on your hands for this generation. So my understanding is this all happens within the next 40 years. Jesus is saying this anywhere from 30 to 33 AD, which gives us till about 70 to 73 AD for all this to happen. If Jesus is right, it should all take place. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple should all happen before the early 70s AD. If he's right, and if we're right in the interpretation, that's what should happen. Then I believe the next question is the sign of your coming, but the Jews don't have a concept of a second coming of Jesus. Again, it's all grouped together. But what Jesus has just said is, you won't see me again. So the illusion is, I'm gonna go away, and then you won't see me until we finally agree that I am who I say that I am. That's when you'll see me again. And so I believe Jesus is separating that for the disciples to understand. And I think he answers the return question in Matthew 24, 36 through 51, and then continuing into chapter 25. It's what I believe is happening. I'm gonna point it out to you, and some of you will care, some of you will not, and then we'll get to somewhere where it actually matters to us today. So that's where we're gonna go here this morning. I believe it's two questions, because in verse 36, Jesus shifts, and he says, but concerning that day, meaning the day of the Lord, concerning that day and the hour, no one knows. He gives great implicit instruction about the fall of Jerusalem, and then basically says, and when am I coming back? I don't know. So things shift a bit there. Then he gives them ways to live in the meantime. Let's continue the reading of Matthew 24 into verse 4. They ask the question, and Jesus, I love the heart of Jesus here. Here's his response: see that no one leads you astray. He doesn't give an answer off the top. His first response is, hey, be careful. Be careful. The question you're asking is deep, and it's hard, and people will come along and give you false information. I want you to be careful. See that no one leads you astray. I'm gonna tell you the truth. Many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, I'm the Messiah, I'm the anointed one, and they will lead many astray. And then he says, you're gonna hear of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not alarmed. All of this must take place, but it's not the end yet. What he's saying is, within those 40 years, you're gonna hear a lot about wars and rumors of wars. You're gonna hear about it. But I'm letting you know, even when it gets dark, it's not the end. Don't get there yet. Don't be led astray, don't be alarmed. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All you need to do is read history from 30 AD to 70, even to 80 and 90 AD, and you see all these things taking place. Now, you say, well, that takes place in my lifetime. And in the one before you, and before you, and before you, and before you. That's why I believe the bookends of the generation are important for us. Here's what he's saying to them. They will deliver you, all these are the beginning of the birth pains. It's all coming. This is the beginning. Then they will deliver you up. Who's they? Well, the false prophets. They will deliver you up to tribulation. Don't read that and think tribulation trail. Don't do that. Don't read that and think Revelation end times. Tribulation actually just means hard time, tribulation. Trials and tribulations of various kinds, James would say. That's what it means. You're gonna face hard times. They're gonna put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Again, historically, all this happened with the early church. We can read about it. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, because that's what happens. When the heat is turned up, that's what happens. The true believers are revealed. Those who are just in it for something else, they are revealed. It happens. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Then verse 13, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. He's saying endure, stick with it. It's gonna be hard and dark, I know. It's not the end. It reminds me of Jeremiah the prophet. The Israelites were sent into exile again, and there's false prophets saying, hey, listen, it's not gonna be that bad. It's gonna be fine. In a few years, it will be over. And then Jeremiah's like, actually, it'll be like 70 years. So build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat from them, get married and have children. You're gonna be in exile. Make a home there. And Jesus is saying, I know it's going to be hard. I just want you to endure through it. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed through the whole world. When you read whole world there, I want you to think Roman Empire. That's the world they know. There's no America, there's no Ivory Coast. Like this is what they know. As a testimony to all nations, then verse 14, and then the end will come. And then verse 15 is where we get into some sticky situations. So when you see the abomination of desolation, which I think was a screamo band back in the 90s, the abomination of desolation, that's a funny joke. You should laugh out loud. That's really good. Spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place. And you see the parentheses there? Let the reader understand. Matthew put that in. Matthew's saying, I know it's hard. I know what Jesus said sounds crazy. Read Daniel. It'll help you. So again, all sorts of debates about what's the abomination of desolation, when did it happen, is it coming to happen, who does it involve? Well, it happens in Daniel. One abomination of desolation happens in Daniel when a Greek leader comes in and creates false worship of a false god inside of the temple. And so my belief is that this is pointing to what would happen in the late 60s AD. 66 AD, the Roman occupation of Jerusalem gets more intense, and it begins what's called the Jewish-Roman War. There'd be about 4 years of war between the Jews and the Romans. In the midst of it, the temple of Jerusalem often gets desecrated by people breaking in and worshiping false gods on the altar in the holy place, the most holy place. I believe that's what's speaking of the abomination of desolation. Jesus is saying, hey, when you see it. But even worse than that, in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And we have a picture of these stones that are not left one on top of another. So Jesus says this, let's say he says it in 30 AD. 30 plus 40 is 70. 70 AD, the temple is destroyed, which I would believe then means within that generation. So it leads me to think this is probably what he's talking about. This abomination of desolation, the temple's been destroyed. The Roman Roman Empire has surrounded Jerusalem and the temple. He said, you're gonna see this happen. There's more evidence of it in what's called the Arch of Titus in Rome, where there's a sculpture carved into this arch of the Roman soldiers carrying away, do you see the lampstand? Carrying away the artifacts of the temple, which leads to all sorts of Maccabean things and all sorts of other stuff. But I believe that's probably what's being talked about here. Jesus is saying it's gonna be bad. And they're coming within the generation. You're gonna pay for this. Pharisees, you're supposed to be managing all of this. And you've made it a den of thieves. Therefore, you will be handed over. So Jesus says, when you see this happening, verse 16, let those who are in Judea, you know there is no Judea anymore. When those who are in Judea, I want you to run. Don't fight, don't put up a fight, don't post about it on Facebook, don't do anything. Just run. Run to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop, which have been like saying, those of you who are in the backyard, on the housetop, don't go down, don't go back in to take what's yours. Let the one who's in the field working, don't go back to get your cloak. And alas, or pity the women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. It's gonna be hard. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, because on Sabbath, the gates of the city would have been closed. You need to get out. For then there will be great tribulation. Again, hard times. It'll be awful. Such has not been seen from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So sometimes scholars would read that and say, see, he's saying it's the worst it will ever be, and then they direct that to end times prophecy. Problem is, this phrase is kind of a fixed euphemism. It's a fixed phrase. So ladies, remember in high school when you found that guy who was unlike any guy you've ever met and unlike any guy you will ever meet again? You remember that guy? And he was 6 boyfriends ago. Do you remember that? Because every guy from there was, I've never met a guy like this before. He's the quarterback of the football team. I will never meet anyone like him ever again. That's similar to what's happening here. And I don't say that jokingly, but also in the Old Testament, speaking of the kings that would come, Hezekiah would come, and he was unlike any king that ever was and ever will be. Well, that wasn't until the next king, who was unlike any king who ever was and ever will be. And so what's happening here is Jesus saying it's gonna be terrible. It'll be the worst thing you think you'll ever experience when this happens. The abomination of desolation. It's going to be terrible. If those days had not been cut short, no human being would have made it out alive. But for the sake of the elect, the church, those days will be cut short. So if anyone says to you, look, here he is. Here's the Messiah. Or look, there he is. Don't believe it. False Christs and false prophets will arise, perform great signs and wonders, so as to, in purpose of leading you astray, if possible, even the church. See, he says, I'm telling you this beforehand. So when you get into it, you're going to know. I told you it was coming. It's not a surprise to me. Got to hang out with Daryl this weekend, and Daryl was talking to me about getting LASIK eye surgery, something like 25 years ago or so, which I think was the beginning of LASIK eye surgery. And I'm not an early adopter, so I would never. But he did. And he said he gets the numbing gel or whatever, and he's under the laser. And the doctor says to him, okay, now I'm going to peel back your cornea. Nope. Now I'm going to get out of this chair. That's what's going to happen. And Daryl said, and then it went black. He couldn't see anything. So which I'd be like, man. Like, no, I'm out of here. But because the doctor had said, this is what's going to happen, okay, you walk in it, you walk through it, perfect eyesight now, all of that. But this is what Jesus is saying is, I'm telling you now, I want you to know now, it's going to get real dark. Don't get out of the chair. Your vision will be corrected. I'm going to peel back your cornea. I'm telling you that beforehand, he says. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, don't go out there. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe that either. You'll know it's me like lightning. Lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west. That's how it's going to be. How will you know it's me? Because you'll know it's me. That's how you'll know. It'll be undebatable that it's me. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. What he's saying is you can look and you can see the vultures, you know where it is. It's obvious where the dead animal is. And then this next set of verses gets even more complicated and confusing. So I want to admit that up front. I'm going to do the best that I can with it. No matter where you land on this, it's just super confusing. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation, the hard times, the darkness of those days, again, what are those days? Abomination of desolation. The sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, which sounds awful. Everything goes dark. It sounds, there's a blackout, everything. It sounds like everything is falling apart. Our pets' heads are falling off. That's what it sounds like here in verse 29. But Jesus, ever the Old Testament scholar, is actually quoting from Isaiah 13. And Isaiah has done this in poetry. And he uses poetry as a way to bring emotion into it, not to give us historical fact. So Isaiah is giving this poem, this prophecy about the city of Babylon. Babylon is the capital city of the most grotesque empire the world has ever seen in those times. And he gives this prophecy about them. Here's Isaiah 13, verse 9. Behold, Babylon, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation. Oh, there it is. And to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. And the sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Sound familiar? So Jesus is referencing this. Now, back in 539 BC, when this happened, did the sun stop shining? Do we no longer have the sun? Do we no longer have stars? Well, no, it's poetry. It's meant to denote how awful it's going to be. Later on in chapter 13, God speaking through Isaiah, behold, I'm stirring up the Medes against Babylon. Enemies of the Jews now will fight against Babylon, who have no regard for silver, do not delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity the children. And Babylon, this great glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, it's a sect of the Babylonians, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. So this prophetic declaration and poem of the downfall of Babylon, Jesus has taken that and now he's setting it on top of the downfall of Jerusalem. So pay attention to what he's doing. Jesus is saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you've become the new Babylon. You're just like them. You're just like the enemies of my people. So he's laid it on top. He sees Jerusalem the same way the Old Testament prophets saw Babylon. So he said, when it happens, this is going to be awful. Verse 30, and then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels. Some translations say messengers there. It's the same word. With a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So you're like, yeah, okay, what does that mean? I don't know. But I know in Daniel 7, it says something just like this. But in Daniel 7, it's not Jesus coming down from the clouds, it's him going up from the clouds, the Son of Man going up. So again, scholars debate back and forth. I don't know. I think it's kind of an in-between of the two answers. I'm not real sure. But then verse 32, sorry to leave you with I don't know, but I don't know. Verse 32, from the fig tree learn this lesson. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know the summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, when you see what I just told you, you'll know that he or it is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. That's where I get the belief this probably is referring to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Heaven and earth will pass away. It's gonna be awful. It's gonna feel like everything's gone to hell in a handbasket. It's gonna feel like you have no hope. If there's no Jerusalem and no temple, what are we doing? But he's saying, but my words will not pass away. You can trust me. Excuse me. And then question 2, I believe he answers in verse 36. But concerning that day and the hour, the question of when will the Son of Man return, when will we see you again? No one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Hey, Meredith, can you bring me my water? I'm getting so choked up talking about this. Thank you, you're beautiful. Okay, so Jesus here, I believe is answering the second question about the coming of Jesus, his return. But I want you to pay attention to what he compares it to. He compares it to the days of Noah from Genesis chapter 6. For in those days, verse 38, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. What he's saying is they were just living their lives. It was Tuesday. They had dinner. They went to Chick-fil-A. They came back home. They got the kids bathed and got them in bed. And then they crashed on the couch. That weekend was a wedding, and so they did all those things. He's saying it was a normal day. In the days of Noah, people were just going about their lives, not even knowing what was happening. Verse 39, they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then verse 40 and 41, pay attention to the context. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding wheat at the mill. One will be taken and one will be left. These 2 verses are used to expound on the teaching of the rapture. That's not what's happening here. Believe in rapture? That's fine. Don't use this passage for that. Here's why. In the days of Noah, when the flood came, who was taken away? The righteous or the unrighteous? Who was swept away? The unrighteous. And who was left? The righteous. In the parables Jesus gives here, the ones taken away are the ones who were absorbed the wrath of God, the unrighteous. The ones who are left are the ones who were righteous. It's not they were taken away and a pile of clothes was left next to the other woman grinding at the mill. It's not what's happening. He's saying the judgment of God will come, and who will stand? The righteous will stand. That's what's going to be like when Jesus comes. Therefore, Jesus is, so here we get to the meat of it. What do? Stay awake. For you don't know on what day your Lord is coming. I don't even know. So how would you know? But you do know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, if the thief announced, I'm going to come rob you at 1:15 this morning, you'd stay awake and would not have left his house to be broken into. Therefore, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So what do we do? What do we do with all this information, with periods of darkness, feeling like the world's gone to hell in a handbasket? What do we do when it feels like everything is off the rails? What do we do? Do we chicken little? Do we cry the sky is falling? Do we write books about the coming of Jesus? What do we do? When everything feels like it's spinning out of control, Jesus says there's 2 things. I want you to stay awake and I want you to be ready. Do these 2 things. Watch and be prepared for my coming. Watch and be prepared. Well, watch what? What are we watching for? Anybody have a Ring doorbell cam or something like it? Do you have something like that on your house? where you can see your entire neighborhood and you can gossip with your wife about your neighborhood? Do you have that? So you see when packages get delivered and you see how certain companies handle delivering your packages differently. You see all that. Anybody do Life 360 or an app like that? Find my iPhone, track my iPhone? Yeah. Do your kids know you have that? Do your kids know you have that on your phone? So back in my day, we didn't have those things. And so whenever my mom and dad would leave to go to the store or go somewhere, that was when I watched The Simpsons, because I wasn't allowed to unless they were gone. And so I was very, very rebellious. And so they would leave, and I also had 5 younger sisters who I turned into my Ring doorbell cameras and my Life 360 as my lookouts. Like, hey, go in the front room. If you see mom's van coming, just let me know. And then I'll turn on TBN. I'll turn it back on and we'll, or whatever, Christian music videos. And so when I read this, I'm like, okay, so I need to watch. Some people read it as, well, let me watch for the sky, watch for what's coming. Let me put all the pieces together. Well, the next verse tells us what we're supposed to be watching. Look at verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant? What are we looking out for? Our hearts, us. In the midst of the waiting, the call is not to have a board in your basement with red string connecting all sorts of theories. The call is not to stare into the sky looking for signs from the heavens that the coming of Jesus is coming. The call of watching is to watch my own heart. Because in the midst of waiting, we get impatient, don't we? We do. And the longer it goes, the more impatient we get. So then which of you, watch, which of you will be faithful and wise? Blessed is the servant whom the master will find so doing, who's giving their servants food at the proper time, who's caring for their fellow servants. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master's taking too long, it's taking too long, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, or watches The Simpsons, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour he does not know, and he will cut him into pieces. This is my last resort. And put him with the hypocrites. Contextually, who are the hypocrites? Pharisees. So Jesus is telling the disciples, be careful. In the midst of your waiting, the danger is you will become the Pharisees. Because you know how the Pharisees got to where they got? Because between Malachi and Matthew was 400 something years. And in their waiting, instead of feeding their fellow servants, they began to beat them over the head with the law. And Jesus telling the disciples, do not be led away, be alert, be watchful, be prepared. Because if your heart is not prepared, you will turn into them. And you know how I feel about them? I cut them into pieces. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The danger for the disciples was that they would turn pharisaical while they waited. The truth is, the same warning is for you and me as well. It's in the waiting that we get abusive. It's in the waiting that in our impatience, we begin to accuse and name call. It's in our waiting we begin to beat and ridicule and mock fellow believers. It's in our waiting, so be careful. Be careful, he says. We are entering a season in our family where our oldest is old enough to stay at home when we're not there, and stay home sometimes with the siblings as well. But there's a time limit on that, man. There's a shelf life on that. So Meredith and I left yesterday to go somewhere, and we were barely out of the neighborhood, and I get a call from Alexa to my phone from my 11-year-old. That's how quickly it all turned into chaos. That's how fast. But I think that's such a great illustration that when you leave unprepared people home alone, it doesn't take long before it spins into chaos. So back to where we began. All the books about the coming of Jesus, you know what that is? It's fear creating chaos and then trying to manage all of it. It's what happens in the church when we get tired of just letting Jesus be Jesus, letting God be God, and just waiting on him. We feel like we got to take matters into our own. He's not coming fast enough. He's not making everything right fast enough. So we've got to take matters into our own hands to handle it. And so here again, here's where we land. I think both apathy and obsession are wrong. I think they do no service to the church of God at all. Neither one. The apathy of doesn't really matter. It's all going to be whatever. I don't care about it. If he comes, it's fine. No. The obsession of, well, that war means this and that connects to this and his name starts with this letter and that letter in the Hebrew alphabet is this many numbers. That doesn't do any help for anybody at all. They're both wrong. In Luke 24, Jesus has been resurrected from the dead, and the disciples go to find him, and they find themselves with their heads at the ground, just groveling, like, I thought somebody took his body. And then Luke tells us that two men in dazzling apparel appear. And they look at the men, and they say, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's risen just as he said he would. Fast forward 40 days later or so, and Jesus is on the Mount of Olives about to ascend into heaven to his rightful throne. And the disciples are there, and Jesus gives the promise, and then he flies, ascends into heaven. And wouldn't you know it, two men in dazzling apparel appear. And they look at the disciples and say, what are you doing? Why are you standing there gazing into heaven? He said he'll return. He said he's coming back. Just as he left, he's coming back. You see, the disconnect for the disciples was the promise of Jesus didn't always line up with their experience on this earth. But the response of the men in dazzling apparel is the same. What are you doing? You see, the head in the sand is apathy. I'm groveling here, didn't go the way I wanted it to, so now I'm just gonna be apathetic. The eyes lifted to the sky is the obsession. I'm just staring until it comes back. But the next statement from the two men is, just go. Jesus had just said, go. You'll get power. Just go. Don't stand here. Go. So how do we handle a world like this? What do we do? What do we do when it feels like our generation might be the one? What do we do when it feels like there's wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines? What do? We don't write books. And we don't put our head in the sand. We receive power from on high, and we stay faithful and true to the command of God to love Jesus and love people. That's what we do. So Jesus is telling the disciples, it's gonna get bad. I know. I'm telling you ahead of time, it's gonna get really dark. But I think the main reason we obsess over this kinds of thing is because we actually don't quite understand the point of the coming of Jesus the first time. You see, throughout Scripture, in the beginning of Scripture, in Genesis, God creates a world where he can dwell with his people, with his creation. And humanity breaks that relationship. And so the rest of the story is God fixing the relationship. And I know you don't believe this all the time, but you know God wants to be with you. He wants to be with you. Broken and jacked up, with all the addictions you have and the struggles you have, with your propensity to gossip, with your laziness and your pride and your arrogance, he wants to be with you. That's the point. He wants to reunite you with him. And the way that he did that was by sending Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. And Jesus gave his life to get away from the divide, to create a bridge, a union back to the Father, to the Creator. And the promise is there's coming a day where we won't have to rely on the Spirit to unite us. We'll actually be with him. That's the promise of the second coming, is that we get to be with him. The thing your soul longs for most deeply, you try to fill with riches and fame and husbands and wives and kids. All those things are going to be satisfied in the presence of Jesus. That's why the second coming matters. He hasn't left us to this. He's coming. And we should look for it and be excited for it, but we should trust that he actually is going to do what he said he's going to do, whether we figure it out or not. Second coming of Jesus is not a puzzle to be solved. It's a promise he will keep. And all your anxiety about it isn't getting him here any faster. One of my favorite things right now is to come home from work. I don't get to come home as early as I want to sometimes, but I love being able to come home from work. I love being able to come home to my family. And I know I'm in a season of life where that's good. because my 7-year-old daughter loves when I come home. And I know 14 is coming, so I understand. I get all that. And just let me have this moment, if you would, please. I love the garage door opens, and I walk in, and I hear, "Daddy's home!" And her little footsteps come running. And she's at the exact right height where it really hurts if she hits me too hard. She does, and I hug her, and let me show you this. Look what I did, look what I made. And it's not every day, but those days, man, I just love it because I love being with her. I love being with my kids. I love being home with my wife. I love it. I can't wait to get home. And I think sometimes we don't think enough about the second coming of Jesus because we aren't desiring for him to come. But what if he came? We're like, oh, he's home. And we heard the door shut and we stopped whatever we were doing and we just ran to him. And we jumped in his arms and he held us and we felt safe and we felt okay. And we felt like everything was right with the world again because it is. I think that's what Jesus is saying when he says to keep watch and to be ready. You can take him and show him all the things you made that day, all the things you were doing. That's what it means. It's not a threat. It's a gift. It's not, you just wait till dad gets home. No, he's coming. He's missed you. And you've missed him. And all the longings of your heart will be satisfied on that day. So don't be apathetic about it. And don't try to figure it out. Can we just delight in it? Can we just delight in it today? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes this morning? I know it's a lot to take in, but I think at the end of the day, we just want to be with him. And I know some of us don't have words to express that, and so we express that through our actions, right? We express it through trying to earn and achieve people's affection and love and adoration. That's all it is, just trying to quell that longing in your soul. The longer it takes, the harder it is to just love each other well. So maybe this morning, the thing you need to wrestle with is whether or not you've been the faithful and wise servant as you've waited. Or have you turned pharisaical? Have we turned angry and cynical and judgmental in our fear, in our angst, in our impatience? Maybe you've grown apathetic and that you don't even care about it. Maybe you've grown obsessed where it's all you think about. So the news feeds inform, they create an anxiety, a fear, a trepidation, or even an unhealthy desire. And not for him to come, but for you to be right. What if you're wrong and you still get Jesus? You okay with that? Then there's some of us here today who I think we've got the wrong idea of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and so we're not. You've been informed by all sorts of different things, media outlets, poor teaching, poor church experience. And I just want you to know what he wants more than anything is to be with you and you to be with him, broken and jacked up as you are. He's not surprised by it. You didn't catfish him with your Facebook picture. He knows. He knows what he's getting into. And that thing you think no one would ever forgive, he already forgave. And that thing you think if anyone found out, they would leave you in a heartbeat, he will never leave you nor forsake you. So would you just come to Jesus today? And get the first fruits of his presence through his Spirit, but believing that one day, you're going to feel like everything's right with your world because it is in his second coming. Father, we are people, again, who we like to figure things out and try to sort things out. I think we think it's going to give us some relief from our fears and anxieties. But for many of us, we've learned it hasn't. In fact, it's just increased that. And so today, would you give us courage to come to you? Do you give us courage to be open-handed, that maybe things aren't going to go the way we thought they were? But if we get you, then we get you. For some of us, give us a longing for that day to actually be with you. Give us a picture of heaven that's greater than whatever we're living today. A picture of your presence that's greater than whatever we have today. Would you make us a people who are awake and who are ready. That we will be the wise and faithful servants. We love each other well, rather than biting and devouring them in our waiting. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.